Okay, so good evening, good morning, good afternoon, and let's start uh, Center for China and Globalization webinar series, China and the World in the and also the in the pandemic crisis series. This is actually our number eight series tonight, and we are very uh, fortunately, we have a very distinguished panelist join us. So the topic tonight is that the world under fire, a role of WTO in a global response to COVID-19 pandemic. And so actually by today, we know that according to the Johns Hopkins University, the coronavirus has infected over 2.4 million people around the world and killed over 165,000 people worldwide. And actually, that's not just that, and it's actually has plunged the world into a global recession. And so this is really the background of discussion tonight. So, so while claiming the lives and ravaging the economies, uh, the pandemic is really exerting pressure on government to embrace the protection policies, various also export restrictions, even on medical supplies. So from this disrupted value chain, how can we really cope with that? And we know that in a joint statement issued after G20 leaders conference in March, the trade minister of G20 actually pledged to take immediately necessary measures to facilitate trade in essential goods and incentivize additional production of the equipment and drugs. So if countries continue to take emergency measures out of a national interest on coronavirus, that really global trade could fall very sharply, according to WTO, as they could fall by a third, according to WTO forecast for this year. So this is really a booming challenge ahead. So in face of this global challenge, can the WTO rise to its occasion to fill its mandate to promote the trade and economics? As we all know that we have all the WTO experts, top experts around here tonight. And this pandemic that we haven't seen in the last century, probably 100 years, and then this is probably the most threats to the mankind after Second World War II. And so how to protect this international order or reinvigorate, including the Bretton Woods system, that's famously like WTO is one of the pivotal role there, fundamental role of existing global trade, so that we can really work on this trade liberalization and facilitation, so that we can getting the world recession out of that. According to the disaster we had in the past, trade has always been a great stimulus to carry the crisis over. And so how can we facilitate the trade? How can we reduce the tariff? How can we really, particularly for the medical protected products, and also how we can resume the WTO appellate body as soon as we can, and also promote the liberalization, facilitation of the free trade. That's really some of those issues. So we are very fortunate. This is the number 8 series of CCG webinar series during season, and we actually had quite a few on trade already. We talked with the chambers of China. We talked with the U.S. General Chamber of Commerce and the U.S. China Business Council in the U.S. We had quite a few with think tanks. So tonight we're really focused on the WTO, and we're very fortunate to be joined by a number of very distinguished panelists. So first, I would like to give some introduction of the senior people that we have invited tonight. I would like to introduce our guest from overseas. We had Ambassador Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of WTO, World Trade Organization, And also currently he's the chair of a Paris Peace Forum, a very well-established forum now, and already in two sections, and it's focused on the global governance. And we had Ambassador Alan Wolf. He's currently the Deputy Director General, World Trade Organization, and also a veteran trade specialist. We had Ms. Wendy Cutler. He's the Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute and former acting deputy U.S. trade representative, and also a very long serving trade top experts. And we also have a Professor James Marcus. He's the distinguished university professor of global affairs at University of Central Florida, and he was the former chief judge at WTO appellate body. From the Chinese side, tonight we have Mr. Huo Jianguo. He's the vice chair of China Society for World Trade Organization Studies and the MOFCOM, and also he's a non-resident senior fellow of CCG. We have Professor Tu Xinquan. He's the dean of China WTO Research Institute at the University of International Business and Economics, also a non-resident senior fellow of CCG. And we have Mr. Li Yong. He's the deputy chair of expert committee, China Association of International Trade, also under MOFCOM, non-resident senior fellow of CCG. And my name is Huiyao Wang. I'm the president of the Center for China and Globalization. So the topic we're going to cover is focused on trade, but in the context of COVID-19. So what are the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on global value chains? What can WTO do to ease export restrictions on pharmaceutical products and food supplies, driven largely by national self-preservation? To spur necessary production of economic activity, countries may rely on non-tariff barriers, such as subsidies that are inconsistent with WTO rules. How will the WTO deal with some countries' efforts to nationalize supply chains? Will the pandemic strengthen or weaken the WTO capacity in coordinating members' trade policy in troubled times? We know that WTO already facing a lot of challenge. So what about this pandemic that will further weaken or strengthen the WTO? Disrupted by global outbreak of coronavirus, how will the WTO regenerate its modernization agenda? And what roles are China and the United States, given the two largest economy, two largest trading nations, set to play in mitigate COVID-19 impacts on trade? Any progress of cooperation between the world two large economy, and that's where I think our panelists are also very familiar with the trade issue between China and the US. So I know that Ambassador Lamy has a lot of thinking lately, and you even calling the gray economy impact. You know that aging people have suffered quite a lot on this pandemic. Maybe I'll give the floor to Ambassador Lamy to speak first. We have a 6-8 minute of each, and then we'll come back a second round and to cross exchanges, and also we will have some Q&A. We have some correspondent questions. We have some live audience questions as well. So once again, I want to thank all of you to participate tonight, but also our viewers in China and internationally. So I'd like to invite Ambassador Lamy to speak first. Pascal, please.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Henry, for organizing this conversation, and thanks to the CCG to do that at this in a very momentous way. I'll start this short remarks with one caveat, which is that there's still a huge number of uncertainties on the size, the timing, and the impact of this crisis. And I think we all need to remember that when we try, which I think we should do, to look at what the world after COVID looks like, we still are in a situation which makes any prediction extremely risky. And yet, I think we need to try to do that. I'll try and answer directly your question, Henry. What, in my view, the impact of this crisis on international exchange, and second, what does this mean for the WTO and its agenda? On the first question, which is what is the likely impact of COVID on international exchange, I think I see five major impacts. One is precaution, two is subsidies, three is environment, four is export restrictions, and five is restriction to the movement of people. Now, starting with precaution, what I call precaution, as opposed to protection, and some of you have already discussed that with me many times. Protection is protecting your domestic producers from foreign competition. Precaution is protecting your people from risks. And I think this is the big trend, what I call precautionism as opposed to protectionism. And I think we will see more of that as a consequence of the crisis. I think the way firms, corporates, business reframe its localization system is also a matter of precaution, which is why we probably will have some sort of some shortening of some value chains, not deglobalization. I don't think this will happen, but we probably will have in some areas, a bit like what we had during the US-China trade war, where there was some disconnection, decoupling on the production of tech devices. We probably will have that in the medical area. So precaution first. Second, subsidies. I think it's obvious that during the crisis and for the enormous stimulus packages we will need after the crisis, there's a lot of public money. A lot of public money is more government, is more subsidies, is more nationalizations, is more public intervention in the economy. And this has a bearing on trade distortion. Then I think because of the connection between the crisis, the health sanitary problem, and some environmental conditions, we will have more focus on health and on environment. And finally, I think we will have an impact on export restrictions. We've seen that during the crisis, quite a lot of export restrictions. And I think we're still in a situation, although as far as medical stuff, they are starting to diminish. There's a big risk that this happens on the food side. I leave aside the restriction to free movement of people, because this is not exactly a WTO issue, although through mode 4, we can see some linkages. Finally, impact on the WTO agenda. I think the concept is that the WTO and the multilateral trading system should keep leveling the playing field, which is a basic condition for trade to remain open. Opening trade is generally about leveling the playing field so that companies, enterprises can compete on a fair ground. We know we're far from that before the crisis, but I think the crisis risks deleveling the moderately leveled playing field we had before the crisis, which is why I think there are a number of things which are desirable. First, reduce discrepancies in precaution, which are basically take the form of non-tariff measures. And reducing discrepancies in precaution is not like reducing tariffs. It's not about reducing the level of precaution. It's about reducing the discrepancies in the way precaution is leveled and administered. So this is a sort of new area, although TBT and SPS agreements are philosophy of that. Second, strengthen subsidies disciplines. We know that the ASCM is a weak, shallow, modest agreement, and there was already quite a lot of that before the crisis in this discussion between US, EU, Japan on the one side and China on the other side. Maybe this discussion might be a bit easier in the future given it's more like US, EU, and Japan looking like China than China looking like US, EU, Japan, in terms of subsidizing the economy and having the role, the state playing a big role in the economy. Then, of course, more rules on export restrictions. We know that in WTO, export restrictions disciplines are shallow, probably because they are nearer to sovereignty than import restrictions. And finally, move the WTO quicker to greening its agenda, which I think is a necessity after the crisis. This is what is, in my view, desirable in a very sketchy way. The final question is whether it is doable. And I think the answer to this question lies in the hands of the US. And I think the game, or whether it is doable or can be done, is largely in the hand of the US. If the US keep not willing to play ball with the WTO, we have one scenario. If the US go back to a position where they agree to play ball with WTO, we have another scenario. The second one is obviously the optimum, but we have to think about the first one because that's what we've seen since Mr. Trump was elected president of the US. So we need a plan B. And the plan B, I think, is WTO minus US coalitions. When the US do not want to engage, this is what happened with a patch that has been found by the EU, followed by others for the appellate body. I think this shows us the way to go if, which I think would remain extremely regrettable, the US keep the same position vis-à-vis WTO after the crisis than before. This is my very short, sketchy summary. Take, Henry.
Thank you, Pascal, for your great remarks. And I think you have outlined quite well all the challenges that WTO is facing, and also all the elements that issues on subsidies, on nationalization, how we can accelerate our WTO agenda, and also discrepancy that we try to correct, and also doable actions, and also particularly, and you have mentioned about the role, or future role of WTO. With I mean, U.S. has a huge role to play, and but if not, we the Plan B scenario that you also outlined. Thanks, Pascal. I know that you have a long time work. You have served 2 terms as a WTO Director General, and also you were once the Chief of Staff for the President of European Commission, Jacques Delors, and he's a shepherd in G7. So you know all those global pictures quite well, and so thank you for your comments. Uh, Now I'd like to invite Ambassador Alan Wolf. Ambassador Alan Wolf, currently he's the Deputy Director General of World Trade Organization, and he has engaged in resolving some of the largest international trade disputes on the record. And so he has also served as chairman of the National Foreign Trade Council, and the chairman of the board of the Institute of Trade and Commercial Diplomacy, and also has served as a U.S. Deputy Special Representative for the Trade Negotiations in the Carter administration, and was a general counsel of the office in the Ford administration. So a very long history. So Ambassador Wolf, you are currently at WTO. So what's your assessment on those issues?
Well, thank you very much, Henry, and thank you to CCG for hosting this very important series. The fact is that there was no coordinated, immediate international response to the pandemic. It's not too surprising. Haven't had a pandemic like this, as Pascal said, you said, for 100 years, and there was no shelf-ready response internationally. It's true that the G20 countries came together, the leaders and the trade ministers, and they had some useful, positive statements to make. But most of the responses are, in fact, national and uncoordinated, even within the European Union. And so the first thing to do was to get transparency, and that's what the current Director General of the WTO sought in the third week of March, and the notifications are coming in, and then to assess what it all means. And as you mentioned, the hit to world trade, the decline, is likely to be dramatic. Every pandemic of the last 250 years, there have been 10 of them, and they've always had a second wave. We don't know how this one will act, but one must be prepared for that. So we could be in for not only the current siege, but a return of great difficulties and disruptions. Countries have been responding, not only with trade restrictions, but also trade liberalizing measures. Those who are more import dependent have had quite a series of trade liberalizing measures, usually lifting tariffs. In the case of some members of the European Union, also value-added taxes on imports. Singapore and New Zealand entered into first a declaration, invited others to come on board, and 5 other countries did, to keep markets open, to keep the flow of trade going. And they then more recently entered into a bilateral agreement with some details on absolutely keeping the borders going, green channels for imports, not having any export controls. And Canada, which is chairing the auto group of 12 other countries, including the European Union as one, has put forward a similar detailed proposal for agriculture to have, but it's tailored for agriculture. So keeping domestic food stocks reasonable, because actually there's globally, there is no food problem. There is stocks are how much higher than they were during the financial crisis, and they are the production of cereals is going to be the 3rd highest on record. There are problems, labor shortages everywhere, every continent, not every country, but every continent. In Malaysia, with respect to palm oil, in England, with respect to getting food out of the fields. There are serious problems with the shutdown of the movement of people, and that has to be addressed. And as Pascal said, that's not a typical WTO matter, though it can be something that's taken up. But the fact of the matter is that there are both problems on the supply side, and there are problems on the demand side, so that shipping from China is off substantially, and ships are taking a longer route to the United States and elsewhere because the demand isn't there, and warehouses are overflowing. The EU Vice President, the Commissioner for Trade, has proposed to the member states, not to the WTO yet, but to the member states, that there be a tariff suspension for medical goods. And one would suppose that there would be a proposal before too long that would be taken up. The WTO works on proposals for members, and not from think tanks. The think tanks have to persuade governments to take a position, and then something can happen in the WTO. The finance ministers met last week, and they mainly are concerned with the macroeconomic matters, so fiscal stimulus, and they reinforce, but they're not leading the trade ministers of the G20 and in their work. Reshoring is likely to take place to some degree, but it is neither an answer nor is it physically possible. Not in the short term, and not very well in the long term. So there are limits to reshoring. It's the antithesis of global specialization. It has high costs, and it's certainly not an answer at present or longer term. the, the fact is that globalization can provide resilience and has, and de-registe policy is, which is what's happening in many locations, wherever the government can intervene to create additional supplies, it is, and it's intervening to prevent those supplies, in many cases, from moving abroad. So moving forward, what should be on the agenda? Better notification of measures. If you look at the Global Trade Alert, which is put out by the Sangala University, it has many more measures than the WTO has, because we only put out what is officially notified, and there's a lag in what is officially notified. Enhanced monitoring can certainly take place. Tariff suspensions on medical goods. There's already a pharmaceuticals agreement that can be expanded to have greater coverage. It has not been expanded in many years. There's an information technology agreement whose coverage was supposed to be reviewed in 2018. That can be reviewed and duty-free treatment given. It's on a non-discriminatory basis. Enhanced trade facilitation for developing countries. That would require funding from the development institutions, the bank, the fund, the regional development institutions. Codes of conduct with respect to best practices, with respect to standards, for food and for goods. Guidelines on allocating scarcity. Pascal is quite right that the WTO has been very proud on giving policy space to countries with respect to export controls. This is not a time for policy space. This is a time for coordination and cooperation. And so there's room for that being addressed. Best practices for sharing IP. There have been some good news in various areas. Those who are researching for a vaccine are cooperating with each other. They're not trying to hold back information. As far as we know, there have been many instances of cooperation across borders. And I know one US company, Medtronic, put on the web its proprietary information on how to build a ventilator so that other firms could simply follow suit and replicate it. So there are some good things happening. It's early days with respect to, from a trade policy perspective, it's early days. In terms of COVID-19, it's not early days. There's something of a lag. One think tank suggested the creation of an emergency response task force in the WTO. That could happen, and we may get into the fact that it's not too early to plan for the recovery. What can trade ministers do to aid in the recovery? Elimination of tariffs, working with the financial institutions on trade finance, which is dried up, is very important. And as I say, helping the least developed and developing countries with trade facilitation. We will be in desperate need of a cooperative response to trying to get the world economy back on track, growth started again. And the immediate needs are to deal with the trade measures to deal with COVID-19, but then there's the need to deal with the aftermath, the harm to the world economy. So I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing from others.
Thanks, Ambassador Wolf, and for your quite comprehensive assessment of the situation. You're absolutely right. I mean, actually on April 8, WTO released the trade forecast. Trade set to plunge as COVID-19 pandemic impacts global economy, and basically saying that world trade is expected to fall by between 13 and 32% in 2020, and COVID-19 pandemic disrupted normal economic activities and life around the world. Particularly also the movement of people, like you and Pascal also mentioned, and also all the region will suffer double-digit declines in this crisis, and also the global value chain will be greatly disrupted. So that's really serious situation. But then we can see that for the older in the history, if we look at even for the World War I, World War II, or 2008 financial crisis or in 1930s, the trade has always been a very good stimulus to put in our economy back. And we have this great trade organization like WTO, and China is becoming a trading nation in the last 30, 40 years, last 20 some years since China joined WTO. So it's really a great, how can we really, as you mentioned, outline all those, we can tariff suspension perhaps, and then and also trade facilitating and also more coordination and cooperation and best practice. And the idea of a task force on COVID-19 for WTO would be also very interesting too. So thank you for all those good comments. Now I would like to invite Mr. Huo Jianguo. He's the Vice Chair of China Society for World Trade Organization Studies, WTO Studies, and he's also a former dean, a former president of the MOFCOM, Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. And he has also involved the China WTO trade negotiations while he was serving at the MOFCOM, and he is now also a non-resident senior fellow at the CCG. So perhaps, Mr. Ho, you can, after we hear from Europe and US.
Okay. Hello.
Yeah, you can speak.
So, thanks for CCG to hold this meeting, and also I'm glad to together to discuss the WTO issues with our old friend, because I know you are all majored in WTO matters. What I want to say is, at present situation, we should concentrate to push the WTO reform, because if this is had some breakthrough, maybe will help the world to have some confidence. That's very important, because we noticed the world under the pandemic influence is become not complicated, it's deteriorated, is everything become to the weak and spoiled. The economic situation and the trade and investment is all a big drop. So that is very serious. And at the same time, people talking more about the globalization. And most people think this pandemic is, will push the globalization to another round, to another direction. It's not very good for the globalization. And also people discuss more about the GVC, global value chain cooperations, and some ideas maybe say China will facing more problems. So all these, I think, linked with WTO. And the WTO reform, it started nearly 2 years, but I think there's no big breakthrough. So at present situation, we should concentrate on the WTO reform. And especially for our experts, we should do something to push this reform. So that's what I think what our obligations. As to the WTO reform, I think I don't understand why about because there are many titles about the developing countries special and differentiate treatment. This is now is discussing very seriously, because American offered many papers on that, and China fight against it. China is formally support the developing countries. So, but for my idea, I think this problem is not the main issues for WTO. This should for the next step, because every people knows that just a principle. And as a matter of fact, no one can benefit it, because if you want to benefit any preferential treatment, you need to negotiate. When you have the entry negotiations, you need to negotiate. So that's not the key problem. But if we keep it, it's very good. And most of the developing countries will welcome it. And they will lay a good foundation for WTO. So I suggest we don't concentrate on these issues. All the other issues, there are many important things. For WTO, we all know there are three pillars. One is for the negotiation. In the history, it's always negotiated for the import, export, for the tariff, to cut down the tariffs. But now I think it should turn on for the rules, for the new rules, or for the old rules, how to make a remedy of the old rules and to start the new rule. I think that's very important, because we really lack of new rules. Through the past many decades, the economic and trade is developing, but the rules unchanged. So we need to do it. And second, I think if we want to support WTO, we need to support the trade review, because that's very important. The problem is that not this trade review doesn't work very well. So as most people talked about how to change, prove the notifications, and how to make the transparent, that's all very important. And the third one is the pilot body. And recently I found the EU and China and some other 15 countries, they worked out a current mechanism, temporary mechanism for this dispute settlement mechanism. I think it's very good, because I understand that's a plurilateral arrangement. Even if it's only 15 countries, I think if more and more countries can join in this arrangement, that's workable. In the history, the ITA and the ETA and some other arrangement, that's all belong to plurilateral arrangement. And I think anything, if it's difficult, we can start make some breakthrough from this plural arrangement. So that's my idea. The more important thing is, at present, the WTO's reform needs some cooperation. The big countries should cooperate, but China and American is the main two paths in the WTO. So China it clearly said we need to push the high level open up. I think as things goes on, if China really push the high opening, it will be good for the WTO reform. And also in some negotiations, we need to understand better. And China will show some flexibilities, and China will consider some countries pursuing. So I think the problem is we need to give some we need to ask WTO to start to work and to form different plurilateral groups and to make it workable. That's what my idea. So I just say this suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hall. And yeah, I think that you have also mentioned quite a few perspectives. Particularly, you're thinking that the WTO is also very important vehicle for promoting the free trade, and also not only for the developed country, but also for the developing country as well. And so you're also concerned about WTO reform and appellate body. I think that we'll hear more from that. We have probably from James as well. And but also I think that as Alan just said, we need more proposal from member countries, so that I hope that all the stakeholders including China, that we can really making more proposals. And I think China is a strong supporter of WTO, and is now become a really very motivated. I mean, particularly after this pandemic, we'll see how important the trade can play. So I think currently WTO probably is is a little less active than we should expect, and then we really hope that WTO can be really more active in the years ahead. So thank you again. And so currently we have about 300 to 400,000 viewers now already online. So it's quite good at this late hours. But I would like to also now invite in Ms. Wendy Cutler. Who's the Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute, a think tank affiliated with Asia Society, and the formerly acting Director, U.S. Trade Representative. And of course, Wendy brings a wide range of trade experience. He's most recently served as a Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, working on a wide ranging of U.S. trade negotiations, particularly well known for her initiative in the Asia Pacific region, and he's responsible for TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which concluded with 12 countries at that time. And so he was also chief negotiator for the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. So with a very rich experience, also we are very pleased to have Wendy join us tonight. And so Wendy, can you share your views as well?
Well, of course, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's such a distinguished panel. Listening to the previous three speakers, I agree with a lot that was said. I would just underscore a point that Pascal Lamy made at the outset, and that is there's so many uncertainties here, and it's underscored by the WTO forecast for trade this year, where the WTO said that trade could contract within a range of 13% to 32%. That's a pretty large range. And they said a lot will depend on the duration of the pandemic, but also policy choices. And I think that's what we're trying to get at tonight. What are those policy choices? So far, in my view, the multilateral response to the pandemic, particularly on the economic side, has been quite weak. We've seen the G20 come out with a leader's statement, a trade minister's statement, and we've also seen the WTO start collecting notifications of restrictions from countries. If we compare the multilateral response to previous international crises, like the global financial crisis, when the G20 played such a key role in moving the world forward and getting over the crisis, it's concerning that the multilateral response this time seems to be weak. In many ways, it's not surprising because we've seen a rise of protectionism and nationalism. This is a public health emergency, so it's only natural for countries to look inward first, trying to take care of their own citizens. But there also has been an absence of leadership. When we look at the WTO, even before the pandemic, there were a lot of challenges the WTO was facing, and Mr. Ho went through some of them. But not only were there conflicts between US and China, but the US has a different view on the appellate body than other countries. Developed countries have different views from developing countries on the whole issue of self-declaration of being a developing country. And the list goes on and on. But nevertheless, the WTO reform agenda is extremely important. And going forward, all of these challenges are going to have to be dealt with. But there's a new layer of challenges facing the WTO, and those are the challenges that this pandemic has brought. we need to keep in mind that we're going to be, we're already in, but we should all get ready for a long recession that's going to hit all regions of the world. Typically, recessions breed more protectionism. So as we all call for more cooperation, I think we need to keep in mind that countries maybe respond in different ways. Second, a new challenge will be there's going to be a real focus on the health sector. And many countries will feel that they were not prepared, and they will become a lot more aware, and they're becoming aware of their vulnerabilities. And this is going to affect the whole global supply chain issue. This also has resulted in a lot of export restrictions, and my understanding is almost 80 countries have export restrictions in place, mainly on medical equipment and supplies, but also on medicines and on food. Under all of this, there's going to be real pressure on the WTO to get in the game, to be relevant, and to really show and produce immediate outcomes, deliverables, early deliverables, not keep, if the WTO keeps talking, it's going to become even more irrelevant. So I just want to put on the table kind of 5 areas related to COVID where I think the WTO could make an incredible contribution if the members work together. Some of them have been mentioned before, so I'll go through them pretty quickly. The first is what I call a sectoral negotiation on medical equipment, medical supplies, medicines. The idea would be not only to lower tariffs among these products, but also to attack the non-tariff measures that are affecting trade in these products. I think this is a ripe area for WTO work in that a lot of countries are already suspending their tariffs on these products as they need to import more and more. I also think everyone in the world knows now what PPP is, and there's a real familiarity with these types of products. So modeled after the ITA2, I think that this is an area where the WTO could work constructively together and rather quickly. And Alan Wolf noted the excellent work already done by New Zealand and Singapore here, where they actually have an annex of products that should be covered by such an initiative. Second, with respect to export controls, it was mentioned earlier that the WTO specifically gave a lot of policy space in this area, but perhaps there's too much policy space. The G20 put forward 4 principles to govern export restraints in these areas, including temporary, transparent, targeted, and proportional. The WTO added non-discriminatory. And what I would propose, I think useful work could be done in trying to elaborate on these principles and make them more operational and more like trade rules in these areas, or at a minimum guidelines or best practices. Third, and I believe this was mentioned by Alan and maybe Pascal, I think the trade facilitation agreement is a great vehicle for dealing with a lot of the logistics and kind of roadblocks we've seen in trade promoted or caused by COVID. And I also think this is an area where we can look at supply chains. Fourth, and this isn't new, but the e-commerce negotiations in my mind become all the more important. The fact that many of us around the world are working from home, I think we're appreciating more and more e-commerce in terms of shopping, but also in terms of communicating with each other. And so the whole digital age is coming on us a lot quicker. A lot of good work has been done in this negotiation, which is a plurilateral, but I think more work needs to be done to take it over the finish line. And finally, and I believe Pascal and Alan touched on this as well as you, Henry, the whole issue of subsidies. This was a big issue for the WTO even before the pandemic, and a lot of concern among the US and other countries about old rules on industrial subsidies and the need to rein them in more. And I think as a result of the COVID response, we're seeing a lot more of state involvement in the economy. And so this is going to be an area that the WTO will need to tackle. So with that, let me just conclude with just two other thoughts. One is that at the end of the day, the WTO is a member-driven organization. And so it's not like the WTO can just do all of this. It's got to come from the members. And let's be honest, that's been a challenge. And second, US-China relations overall are not in great shape. There's a lot of friction in the relationship. On the trade front, progress made with the phase 1 trade deal. But when you look in the WTO, there has been a lot of friction between the US positions and China's positions. That said, I do think that some of the ideas that we're putting forward now could benefit from US-China cooperation. And I think in some of these areas, there is great overlap of interest and concerns between the United States and China. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, and for your very comprehensive and also very thoughtful comment and talk. I think I also agreed that many of your points that particularly now as the sectorial negotiation on this pharmaceutical, medical supplies and equipment and things like that, that really saving lives, and that is really in this crisis that the pandemic spread, where still haven't yet seen that to spread to the developing countries. So I think this is really most important. I think WTO can play some leading role on that, and also trade facilitations, best practices, and you mentioned about e-commerce. That's really fabulous. That's really experience that China has now. That this e-commerce, this digital supplies that has actually sustained China quickly come back in this coronavirus crisis as well. And then also, I think you gave a very good idea of how to, for the future WTO reform, the member state that really should be more active. That's really true. And then also how to cut subsidy. And you particularly mentioned about US-China relation frictions, and I really agree with you on that. And I know that on April 6th, you and Daniel Russell, another colleague from your institute, and also published an article in Foreign Policy calling for US-China cooperation. And you said this is a contest with no winners, and then the two countries should immediately begin working together to develop and conduct clinical trials for coronavirus vaccine and treatment. That's really absolutely correct. And life and saving is so important. After all, we are facing a common enemy for the mankind, and all the human global villages should work together. Thank you again, Wendy, for your comment. Now I'd like to invite Professor Tu. Professor Tu, he's the Dean of China and WTO Research Institute and the University of International Business and Economics. Also non-resident senior fellow of CCG. And actually also Professor Tu was a visiting scholar at the WTO Secretary from June 2011 to September 2011. So he's a top expert on WTO in China. Now I'd like to, after we hear from friends from US, I'd also like to hear now Professor Tu, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for Henry's invitation. I'm happy with such a distinguished panel, especially some old friends here. I don't want to focus on the pandemic too much. It is true that the pandemic has put world trade and economy in crisis, but the WTO has been at risk for many years. So the reason is not the pandemic. I think one major reason is the growing differences between the United States and China over a lot of a wide range of issues, as Wendy mentioned. Now the incompetent WTO cannot help with dealing with the pandemic and the associated economic and trade damages. And now numerous members have taken the self-defined discretion to impose trade restrictions on medical supplies and necessities, since there is no authority restraining them. While the world is in bad need of international cooperation, the major powers are busy with finger pointing each other. As we all know, the WTO is a member-driven organization. So don't blame the WTO or the WTO Secretariat for doing nothing if the major members don't want to do anything. So I think it is really time for them, especially the two largest economies and the trading nations in the world, to take their respective responsibility to lead the world forward. For the United States, since the Trump administration imposed additional tariffs on the Section 301 in early 2018 on Chinese products, I have had no any expectations on its rationality of moving back to the old trajectory of pushing forward multilateral trading liberalization. The Trump administration seems to be only believe that its power could win all what it wants. It does not need international institutions or allies. Now the pandemic has shown its irresponsibility more clearly. Even for its own people, is just trying to blame China, the WHO, and even Obama for his disastrous failure in containing the pandemic. So I don't think the Trump administration has any interest in reviving the WTO at all. However, I still believe the administration does not represent the mainstream among American elites. There are a lot of intellectual persons like James and Wendy in the United States. And also I noticed that Mr. Joe Biden wrote a paper published paper on foreign affairs, declared that America must lead again. If he could win the election, the United States might go back to normal again. To be sure, China has never intended to challenge the leadership of the United States in the world, as the Chinese government repeatedly claims. We would welcome the US leadership back to the world stage. Then for China, while not ready to take the leadership, it is really time to take more responsibilities. In China, there is so-called China responsibility theory or whatever. It's not a good phrase, but I think it is really time for China to take more responsibility, especially in the WTO. It is no problem that China has broadly met up with its commitments and obligations under the WTO. However, the anxiety and dissatisfaction of other members on China, not a few, but a lot of members on China, are real and not baseless. So the discrepancies between the systems of China and other market economies are even larger than smaller after so many years of China's WTO membership. This is definitely not intentional. When China joined the WTO, nobody could predict what has happened since then. But we really need to carefully look into the divergences between China and others. We cannot neglect them or pretend that the others will be happy with it. China always likes to claim that one of our principles of foreign policy is to seek common ground while reserving differences. Nevertheless, if you don't take initiative to seek the commonness with others, you will be left outside. So my suggestion is simply that simple, which is to accord with international norms, as China did after the WTO accession. Of course, now members are talking about the modernization of WTO or WTO reform. So in this context, I think China could take some concrete steps to unilaterally accelerate domestic reforms on the relationship between government and market. Actually, the Chinese government just published a new policy on the marketization of factors markets. So I think it's a good step. And also at the same time to cooperate with other interested members to update the rules on those issues. So only when both the United States and China are willing to take their responsibilities to the WTO authority could be revived to regulate world trade and fight with those destructive trade measures. But either side does not need to wait for the other side. I think a lot of self-interested actions can be taken by each of them. Don't punish or don't blame. Don't punish yourself because of others' mistake, and don't blame others for your own inaction. So that's my thought. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tu, Xinchuan. Yeah, I think you have, you know, as an expert of a WTO studies, but you're also the vice president of a WTO Studies Society of MOFCOM. So you have actually outlined many great points as well. I agree with you that I think it's a consensus actually we have on this panel is that member states of WTO should take more active roles rather than waiting for WTO. WTO is a member-driven, and proposal has to come from member countries. And you mentioned that, you know, being the two largest trading nations, China and US should take more active roles. And now we see that US is, under the Trump administration, is taking less active role and actually is threatening to quit WTO. So I agree with you that China should probably take some more active roles. And, you know, as a matter of fact, China is doing many things also that China is greatly accelerated its IPR issue, setting up intellectual property courts. China on April 1st now relaxed the foreign financial sector's entry into Chinese financial market. And China also set up many special economic zones. And so I agree with you, you know, it's for our own interest to be more open, and the more you open, the more prosperous you are. And particularly in this pandemic crisis, that we cannot stop the opening up of our society, and also working with other countries as well. So thank you for your contribution. Now, but I'd like to also invite Professor James Barkus, and he's a distinguished university professor of global affairs, and he's at the University of Central Florida, and he's well known for his former chief judge of WTO appellate body, and so he actually he was one of the 7 founding members and served twice as the chairman of appellate body of the WTO, the highest international tribunal of world trade. So he's also a former member of Congress of the United States and a former U.S. international trade negotiator. So we're also, I'm also very pleased. Thank you for receiving me last time at the theater in DC as well. So Professor James, it's your turn, please.
Thank you very much, Wang, and thanks to CCG for inviting me, and thanks too to all of my colleagues on this panel, most of them longtime friends of mine. Others I look forward to getting to know as the world continues to turn. We're hoping it will turn in the ways we've been speaking about. I agree largely with all that's been said. I especially want to embrace what Wendy Cutler has said about the weak response that I see from our multilateral institutions. Wendy belongs in the American Hall of Fame of International Trade Negotiators, as I'm sure you all know. And I'd like to identify also, especially with the remarks just now of Dean Tu, who is a good friend of mine and is a citizen of the world as well as China. And it's that I want to focus on. We have representatives on this panel from 3 of the largest and most influential political entities in the world, the United States, China, and the European Union. A number of us, such as the DG, have served globally and are certainly not limited to national views. Alan's doing that now. I have had the privilege, as was mentioned, of serving all the members of the WTO and the appellate body. But this particular challenge we face raises some fundamental issues that I think need to be addressed. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm very much in favor of increasing international legal obligations to provide a framework in which, for example, trade flows can increase and the opportunities and gains from trade can likewise increase. I'm in favor of more and better rules. There are many, many things we could and should be doing. Wendy's mentioned a number of them. So is Alan, so is Pascal, in terms of this particular pandemic. And then we have, as others have reminded us, a whole long list of other issues ranging from digital trade to competition policy to investment to IP to services that need to be addressed, these and more, if we're going to make the WTO a 21st century international organization. But beyond legal obligations, whether they exist or not, I think we need to be thinking of our moral obligations. What do we owe to each other? What do we owe not only to those who happen to have been born as citizens of the same country as we have, but also what do we owe to people on the far side of the world? Last week, the United Nations issued a frightening report predicting that because of the fact that they lack a lot of the infrastructure and other resources that we have in places such as the United States, China, and the European Union, the countries in Africa will likely see 300,000 deaths or more from this pandemic. Whether we have a legal obligation to help them or not, I believe we have a moral obligation to do so. Of course, all of these countries are members of the WTO, and we all know that they don't have the capacities to fulfill many of their obligations. This is why no one has ever sued a least developed country in WTO dispute settlement and is unlikely ever to do so. But what about now? What we're seeing worldwide in this weakness of a multilateral response is an increasing turning away from global solutions and inward to nationalism, protectionism, and outright xenophobia. And what we're seeing in terms of the continuing bickering between the United States and China does no one any good. It doesn't help the American people, it doesn't help the Chinese people, and it certainly doesn't help the people of the rest of the world. Those of us in the United States and China need to stop worrying about who the leader is, as Dean Tu said, and we need to start leading. Pandemics are one of the systemic risks of globalization. All of us have always known that there are these systemic risks that are the potential downsides of globalization. Pandemics are one, climate change is another, other ecological challenge can be others. There's the internet and cyber terrorism and other threats to our information infrastructure worldwide and so much more. And we all know too that global governance has trailed far behind global integration, not only economically, but in many other ways. Well, now that's catching up to us because systemic risks require systemic solutions. They require multilateral efforts. They require countries to cooperate and work together. And the hard truth is that in terms of international cooperation, a lot of it's simply not going to succeed unless both the United States and China are fully engaged and working side by side. This is true in climate change. I think it's also true here. And it's going to be true going forward in many, many other respects. The European Union made an outstanding proposal last week, as some have already mentioned, about eliminating some of the barriers to trade in medical goods and equipment and medicines. And this certainly needs to be done. The Europeans have shown leadership by coming forward to make that proposal. And as been mentioned, we've had smaller countries, Singapore, New Zealand, and others who have come forward as well. But unless the United States and China are in the forefront of this effort, it's not going to become truly global, and it's not going to succeed as it should. And we are not going to be able to fulfill our moral obligation to the billions of other people in the world who are greatly at risk and more at risk than many of us are. And this is why I think we need to put aside the bickering, put aside the geopolitics for a moment, certainly stop all the finger pointing. Historians can assess all this later on and assess blame if they must. But in the meantime, we need to put all that aside and work together. The WTO is one place where we must do so. It is an institution that has been neglected lately. Largely, I'd say this is the fault of my own country and our unfortunate leadership here now. But we need to transcend that and use the WTO as the global institution it has to be. Alan has rightly pointed out a number of the good things that are currently happening. It's not just that everything is bad and only bad things are happening, but these good things can and must be multiplied. One issue that I want to underscore that has already been mentioned in passing by a couple of those on who are also on the panel is the question of food exports. I think we are going to see a proliferation of restrictions on trade in food. Roberto Azevedo, our Director General of the WTO, was warning about this several weeks ago and has done so repeatedly. Others with the WTO are warning about this. So far, we've only seen this in some of the smaller countries. We've not seen it really in the bigger ones. But as the problems with these food supply chains multiply, as Alan has mentioned, in part because of the labor problems in a lot of the producing areas, we're going to see fear about food. And I think we need to step forward as a moral obligation to make certain that hunger is not increased in the world because of this pandemic. Under the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we promised in 2015 that we would end hunger in the world. So we need to be moving in that direction and not in the other direction. As we all know from our studies of history and our own experiences, there is ever this illusion of self-sufficiency, this notion that the Greeks called autarky, that we could produce everything we would ever need right here, wherever we happen to be, and not rely on anyone else. This is always a superficial temptation, but it is an illusion. No country in the world is ever going to be able to produce everything it will ever need. There's always going to be something it's going to have to get from someone else. Now, of course, we've learned that we can't rely now totally in the business community on lean management and just-in-time production. We have to have better inventories. We have to have some more redundancy in our supply chains. The lack of that is not anything that's been caused by the WTO, by the way. It's simply something that has happened in the marketplace. Um, but imposing governmental restrictions on trade and food has always been a mistake and is even more of a mistake now and going forward. And that needs to be at the top of our list. If it's not, then we're going to see as many people dying of hunger in the poorer countries in the world as of the COVID-19. Thank you so much, Wang, and thank you all.
Thank you, James. You have made very good remarks that there is, like you and Wendy and others all said, that there's really a weak response from multilateralism, and that is also a consensus of all the panelists, and I think that is really very damaging to the world, not only as you said. To the African countries, the developing countries, and also according to the World Bank report on East Asia and the Pacific in the time of COVID-19, there are going to be 11 million people across the region would be forced into poverty, according to their World Bank report on that. And so this is really a great, that time that we have to discuss all those multilateral solutions. And I agree with you that the global, I think that really global trade governance is falling behind global practice now, and not only on those many issues you mentioned, also on this, particularly on the food you mentioned, but also I think that climate change, and as I also mentioned, I remember I was at the WTO annual meeting last October. I attended, we made a speech there on the plastic waste, how we can, WTO members to take some consensus working on preventing the waste into the ocean and into the value chain. So that's really all the issues I think WTO can do, and then we need a really active response. So thank you again for your good comments there. Now I'd like to invite also Li Yuan. He's Deputy Chair of Expert Committee, China Association for International Trade, and MOVCOM. And he is also a non-resident senior fellow of CCG. And so Mr. Li is also a longtime trade expert. He's both at expert member of the China Association for International Trade, but also China Society of WTO Studies. So he's been very active as well. So Mr. Li, please.
Oh,
yeah.
In
Hello.
the United States, we were visiting the United States together with Minister Chen Deming, and at that time we were talking about China-U.S. relations. The trade deal. Everything has become, as I would say, pre-existing conditions. Let's use the popular words of pandemic. And today we are really facing a very serious situation. And I agree, most of the previous speakers, I think, their observations are unique and offer very interesting perspectives in terms of where we should go and what is happening on the ground. But anyway, I think we need also to look beyond or below the superstructure, because the pandemic has changed almost everything. Okay, if we don't really have a perspective or have an understanding what is happening on the ground, what has changed the foundation of the superstructure of the WTO, I think it is going to be very difficult for us to really to move forward any of the reform agenda, anything that is going to that is going to contribute, for example, multilateralism, globalization, and so on. So I think we need to go in probably we need to look at a little bit of nuances. What are the changes? Okay, this pandemic is going to bring us. Like, we need to do a little bit of a diagnosis. Is the WTO body had shortness of breath? Okay, do we have body aches? Is WTO or members have lost senses? They cannot smell, they cannot taste, or they are coughing, or they are coughing in a different ways. And coughing, as everybody knows, is contagious, right? So what I see, probably, there are some kind of changes, like shortness of breath. Probably the result is, the consumer's behavior is going to change, lifestyle is going to change. Okay, the consumer market pattern is going to change, and that is going to have an impact on the pattern of trade, on the relationship, like Wendy mentioned, on the negotiation of e-commerce, right? Because, this will change the driving force of the consumer market, right? The second thing change probably is going to be in the business environment, how businesses are being operated. Previously we have, pre-existing rules, legal framework, everything, okay, that is going to guarantee, a smooth sailing of any business ideas. But today, I think business environment is going to change because, national governments are thinking about their countermeasures from their own perspective. Okay, their tolerance of the globalized, business probably is going to be affected. I'm not sure to what extent, but there will be some kind of a changes. And the supply relationship. Everybody is talking about supply relationships, right? What the pessimistic, they say, supply chain is going to be eternally damaged. Okay, this is not going to be the same anyway. But we also need, from the perspective of WTO, whether there's a chance to strengthen the supply chain. Because, if everybody is talking about the death of a supply chain or the end of the global value chain, we are almost, agreeing to see the free fall of the global trading system, right? So something must be done, okay? And then the regulatory environment is going to change, right? And the regional trading pattern is going to change, okay? And how those change will contribute to the well-being of the global economy. So I think it is never, ever underestimated to say, or that trade is the savior of the world economy. If we don't have trade, I think the world is going to fall apart. The world is going to be divided. The world is going to be in a disastrous relationship. Okay, a situation. So trade actually is something, that can bring, countries together and help countries to work together to help each other. Without this trade connection, everything we talk about, reform, okay, whatever legal framework, okay, is not going to really move the world forward. So what we really need to do something, okay, and we need to be wary of the potential dangers, the potential barriers, which I identified as 6 Ps. Okay, and I think everybody realizes those 6 Ps. First one is panic. Okay, people, general public is panic about the virus. But what about national governments? Okay, I think bad panic probably has driven the overdosage of physical and monetary policies, which is a spillover, which Pascal Lamy mentioned about the flooding of public money, which may have distorting effect on global trade. Okay, and those money, if not controlled, if not coordinated, if not talked about under the framework of WTO, I think it is going to be disastrous. It's not really the life water. Okay, the second one is phobia. Okay, we see a lot of examples: xenophobia, xenophobia, whatever. Okay, and that is dangerous. Okay, and the third one is paranoid. Okay, the kind of persistent suspicion, prejudice, whatever. Okay, I'm not really talking about specifically, but those will fan up. I mean, unhealthy sentiments, and will drive politicians to go to extremes in their decision making. So what we see in this world, in some of the countries, why we don't really understand what is happening over there, because of this panic, because of this phobia, because of paranoia.
Okay, quick.
Yes, and I have just two more, and then that is going to be my the end of my my session. Okay, the fifth one is protectionism. Okay, I don't need to talk about it because protectionism has existed, and it will exist, and probably there will be what I called we need to all to be wary of is trade related sectoral policies and sector related trade policies. If we don't really watch on those, they will come and haunt us. The last one is populism. Okay, that drives politicization. Okay, that's the last one. Okay, politicization is going to distort everything, not just the economy, social order, even mental health or moral health. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee. And then I think your 6 Ps are well summarized, and particularly protectionism. I mean, that's the least we need these days, and also we really should be worried about the populism that is spreading around the world. And so how we can get back to the more normal situation is really a great work that facing all of us. So I'm glad that we talk about all those issues tonight as well. We had a very good discussion tonight. I was told by staff that we have over 600,000 viewers now online and watching us live. And so I think this panel was really stimulating and high level. It's representing 3 largest trading blocs in the world. U.S., China, and the EU, and and also the all the seasoned outstanding experts on WTO and trade issues, and we had many people watching and discussing, and we even got some questions as well. And so in the next phase, we still got a half hour left, and we will have some feedback from you for this whole discussion. And I know Pascal has done a lot of thinking in that, we were thinking also about what about balance of government and business, state, and business sector, market sector. Should we have more interventions? And the global governance is really waking. What about WTO, WHO, FAO, and also the gray area economy, which is I think that the first gray crisis, so to speak, we have. And so in this kind of a context, how we can, I know that we have some Chinese also thinking that how we can really minimize those trade restrictions, protectionism during this crisis. Life saving is really should be priority, and how we can reduce the tariff, particularly for the medical supplies, and also how we can really restore WTO appellate body, and then make WTO fully functional. And Wendy mentioned about sectoral focus also. Very good discussions. And so I'll just go through a few questions as well, and I would like to hear all of you for your final comments. We have one question from GMM News. He's a Chinese press here. He mentioned that the shortage of medical supplies during the coronavirus pandemic remind many countries the importance of the manufacturing industry. But yet we also see some countries calling, manufacturing to bring back the manufacturing. Should that really ushering a new era of protectionism? If everybody does its own, then what's the meaning of a globalization? So what can be done there? And also China Business Network also asked, CBN asked, said many countries have put new curbs on export and investment. WTO rules allowed for some restrictions in the event of a shortage or health threats, but it can also disrupt the supply chains and harm countries that have rely heavily on imports. So how could we solve that problem as well? And they also asked that the EU formed a multi-party interim appeal attribution arrangement, MPIA, together with other 15 participating WTO members. So what do you think about this arrangement? And also Global Time has asked that we see some politicians also, there's a series that holding China accountable, and there's also blames from many fronts and each other. So how should we avoid this kind of political, downward spiral? Rather than we really work together to save the world from the pandemic, particularly for the China and the U.S. And also there's another media from China Financial and Economic Publishing House. What challenges does the global spread of COVID-19 bring to the global governance, to the WTO? And we would aggravate the trend of deglobalization. So are we seeing a turning point of turning for the better or turning for the bad? So that's a question. I think we had a fascinating discussion up to now. And so I would like to, in the next half hour approximately, we would have each of you give some response, 3 or 4 minutes, probably, maximum 5. So probably, we just follow the same order. Maybe Pascal, you want to start again?
Thanks, Henry. On these questions, which are absolutely relevant, on the reshoring issue, I think Alan has said it. There will be a bit of reshoring, but mind you, this is costly. Now, the reason why we have these global production chains is not a decree of God. It's just that market capitalism makes it more efficient to multi-localize production in order to benefit from specialization. So there will be a bit of reshoring at a cost, and fine with that if this is what people and sovereigns want, provided we have a clear idea of who pays for the cost. And if it's consumers, it usually will be the weakest and least favored parties of our populations. So it will just make poverty a bit more rather than a bit less. As I often said, I've always said globalization is efficient and painful, but I also know that deglobalization is inefficient and painful. So we should be very clear on this. On the emergency measures and the question that was raised about this, there have always been emergency measures in trade and in trade policies. On the import side, there's an agreement on safeguards. There should be a better agreement on the export side with safeguards. There are specific circumstances, like in our life, in our national systems, when emergency justify exceptional measures. The whole problem is how do you define the exception? How do you contain these exceptions so that it doesn't become an open bar? And this is what WTO disciplines are about. I remember when I was EU Trade Commissioner, even within the European Union, there remained possibilities of export restrictions in case of dire emergencies. On the appellate body patch, I think the EU has done what it should do, which is stand somewhere between US and China and put pressure on the US with China and put pressure on China with the US. And there is, I'm not saying this is a marvelous solution, it is a patch, because if a country, and this is what the US did, uses the consensus principle to take hostages, this is not a fair game. And then others have to find a way to exit the hostage through the back door, which is what the EU, China, and a few others did. And I think this is the way to go. On the rest, I agree with a lot of what my colleagues have said, and I think there is sort of a very interesting convergence, starting with one thing, which is that the risk is clearly that this COVID crisis makes trade more difficult rather than easier. I think there is a consensus on that. And who will be the main victims? Poor countries and poor people in rich countries. This is the blunt reality of what will happen if trade is less open. And I think there is an economic, a political, and as Jim said, a moral case on this. I'm all in favor of a sectoral in pharmaceuticals, 0 for 0, but mind you, in pharmaceuticals, the main obstacle to trade is not a tariff. The main obstacle to trade is a certification system in an area where we'll understand that people have a high degree of precaution when they allow to market a new drug into their market. So if we really want to open trade in pharmaceuticals, we have to put together a system that levels, harmonizes the level of precaution, and there's no place to do that so far in the international system. So some sort of WTO, WHO, a bit like with what we have with Codex Alimentarius, which works reasonably well. We should set up something specific if we really are serious about the sector in pharmaceuticals. And finally, I like all my colleagues to say that WTO is a member-driven organization and that this is a fatality. I beg to disagree. As I often said, I was offered, when I became DG of WTO, a nice cartoon by a former colleague of WTO, and the cartoon was a tree, and a car had trashed in this tree. It was all in pieces. The tree was fine, but the car was totally broken. And the legend of the cartoon was member-driven car. Now, this says a lot about what should be done in terms of reform of WTO. A big piece of the reform of WTO would be to accept, like in any international organization, and many of them are much less sophisticated than WTO, that the Secretariat is given the authority to table proposals. And I mind you, I've worked with these people during 10 years. They are extremely good. They are extremely expert. They are extremely objective. And I can bet that 90% of proposals by the Secretariat of WTO would be of a better quality than what members table. So this should not be a taboo.
Good. Thank you, Pascal, for your concluding remarks, and which is very enlightening as well. I mean, you said that globalization is efficient, but also painful. But the deglobalization is inefficient and painful. So right. I mean, you know, the history of mankind has shows that, but also experience of China has demonstrated that embrace the globalization, that you know, it benefit many people. China has been able to lifting 800 million people out of poverty. I mean, it's largely also thanks to trade, global trade, and I think we really need to uphold that as well. And you're right, pandemics make the trade more difficult. But you are also made a very interesting point that you know, Secretary of WTO can be more active. I think it's a combination of a secretary and also member countries, but we need a specialist secretary to be more active as well. So now we would like to have you know, we're having the current Deputy Director General of WTO, Ambassador Alan Wolf, on this panel. So Alan, please. I remember your speech at the CCG just last year. You highlight many points as well. So we would like to hear from you again.
Thank you very much. And I applaud what's been said so far. I agree with probably all of it. There are three phases. We have the emergency response, what we do now with respect to meeting the COVID-19. And I don't see that as mainly a technical problem. There will be technical aspects. There certainly will be. There are problems of standards. But first, there's a problem of political will. And who are the countries with greatest capacity, or the members with greatest capacity? The European Union, the United States, and China have enormous amounts of capacity, even working remotely from homes. They can do a lot in terms of coming up with proposals and driving the process forward. But what has happened? Mid-level countries have stepped forward. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Singapore, and others, and with some good ideas and that have been put on the table. There are areas that the WTO is not used to dealing with. Export controls can be, the regime can be expanded in terms of coverage, but preemptive purchasing, which is really an area of competition policy to some degree, government activities, seizures of goods, these are sort of abnormal, driving up prices, which may be all right. The market may allocate for developed countries, but it doesn't do a good job for allocating supplies for developing countries, least developed, certainly not at all. So can something be done? Sure it can, if there's the political will to do it. I don't think short-term we're going to have any agreement on subsidies disciplines. As has been mentioned, they're relatively weak, but that's not a short-term issue. But the second phase, which is recovery, there is room to do things like work on subsidies, backing governments back out of the market to the extent possible. I don't think you can, you could have a standstill, for example, on additional restrictions, but I don't think that's good enough. I think you need to have something that's positive. And I would hope that finance ministers and foreign ministers join world leaders as well as trade ministers to drive that process forward. It used to be, I mean, the multilateral trading system was devised by foreign ministers and treasury ministers, finance ministers. They have to become, they can't abdicate that responsibility. I think they have to become more involved. Third phase is the future. I would hope that this policy planning units, not only within the WTO, but within member countries, that worry about the multilateral trading system exclusively. China, CCG has brought together on more than one occasion a lot of expertise on the WTO, and there's a lot of expertise on this call in that regard. We need planning for the future. I agree wholeheartedly with what Pascal and Lee has said in terms of governance. It's not just the Secretariat, it is also the how the members govern their processes. The World Bank and the IMF have boards of governors. They don't try to have all meet all at once. There's probably some future learning to be done with respect to how the members organize their work, as well as the role of the Secretariat. With respect to, one question was on the MPIA. We're not going to solve the appellate issue with respect to jurisprudence very quickly, I don't think. But it needs to be resolved. There needs to be a single appellate mechanism that has legitimacy in the eyes of all major users of the litigation system and those who would like to use it. We have to get back there. But that's not going to be an instant process. It's going to take some real work. So I think there's much to be done to shape the future, and that the major governments have to come together and with anyone else who can supply some answers and think about reform in a more comprehensive way than has been the case to date. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Wolf. And you're right. I think that you're very you pointed a real key issue of political will. I think that is where's the will, there's a way. And U.S., EU, and China being the three largest trading blocs, and how to demonstrate that multilateral leadership. It's really the key. I think that member countries, you're right. Even now, medium power countries like Canada just hold a trade meeting in Ottawa without the U.S. and China participating last year. So I think that it's an issue now, given the crisis, that we all should really work together and forget about the ideological differences and really work for the benefit of the humankind. And so at least the G20 trading minister should really work harder and try to resolve the issue. So that's why I think your comments are also very interesting. And also you came to China, you met Premier Li last year, attending the China and +5 meeting. So it's good that you hear your new thinking again. I would like to invite Mr. Ho, our NARA senior fellow, to say have final comments as well. Mr. Ho Jianguo.
Oh, hello. I just want to talk on the GVC, because now people talk more about the GVC problem. They said under the pandemic influence, many investors in China maybe will flow out. I don't believe this assessment. I think at present, because in February, China is have a heavy block and maybe some productions is stopped. But we noticed for April or nowadays, China is recovered for the production, and the outside world maybe have more problems. So people talking more about the GVC is spoiled and it needs to reallocate it or readjustment. I think it's not true. The problem is American is really have sent out some signals to urge the American enterprises back to America. And also recently, Japan had some policies to subsidize the Japanese factories to back to Japan or to Southeast Asia. And I think it's had some certain background. So on the whole, I believe China's production and its labor and also the logistics is good. And if China will continue to open up and also to create a fair competition environment, I think it's good. And maybe in some industry, for light industry, for daily necessities, because all these productions, the cost is still high. Maybe some will transfer to some other, even some Chinese factories ourselves will find a way to make some investment outside. So some foreign investors maybe will make some adjustment because their profit is not good or their business is difficult. But for those who can earn money in China, I don't believe they will withdraw from China. I don't know whether this is true or not. I don't understand even if in American, the government, if they call on the factories to back up, whether the factory can listen to them or they have to listen to the government. So that's my question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's really a hard decision, and it's really a market and economic decision whether to relocate or not. I know there are some probably China graduating from some industries, but maybe shift that to some development countries. But largely, I know that multinational steel feels that China first is the biggest market. Second, the upper and the downstream value chain is so developed here that it's very cost effective with the huge talent pool of 170 million people as a skilled talent that you don't find that kind of a marketplace in the world. So according to the AmCham chairman who we were on the webinar CCG organized last time, he was mentioning that even for the survey there, majority of them still feels China is a right place to do business. So I think I agree with you that that is very difficult given the globalization era. So now we will have Ms. Wendy Cutler, and as you are a seasoned, very experienced trade negotiator. So what's your final thought and
just a few quick comments. I realize we're coming up against our closing time. First is that I think we've done a good job today kind of building a list of all the issues the WTO can work on, and we've been adding to that list throughout the evening. What I would just urge everyone, and not only the governments, but think tanks and other people that are discussing these issues, is the need to prioritize the work for the WTO. I mean, I think the worst thing coming out of this crisis could be for the WTO to have 20 different work streams going on and really not achieving outcomes in any of them. So a certain amount of prioritization will be necessary. Second, we haven't spent a lot of time on the issue of food export restrictions. I think right now people would agree it's not really a problem, but there is concern they could become a problem as countries panic and fear that there will be food shortages. And here I would just hope that people would look at what was done in addressing these types of issues in 2008 to 2010, where some of our panelists, as well as leaders of other organizations, including my boss, Josette Sheeran from the World Food Program, worked with the World Bank, my other boss, Bob Zellick, and even my other boss, Kevin Rudd, who was Prime Minister of Australia. And people really came together at very senior levels to deal with that issue. And so if that becomes an emerging problem, the wheel should not be recreated. And finally, with respect to supply chains and value chains, Let's be honest, there were adjustments being made to these supply chains before the pandemic. The US-China trade war and tariff imposition led to some of those adjustments. And the COVID pandemic is going to further accelerate some movement of supply chains. The question is, how extensive will those adjustments be, and what will the policy responses be? I think for companies, it's going to be very important to them not to just rely on cost and efficiency. I think they understand now they also have to look at the location of their supply chains, look at their vulnerabilities, and then come up with ways how they can become resilient. And that may mean moving production closer to home or to different sites all around the world, but they will be making those decisions. Governments will also be looking at supply chains. I think particularly in the health sector, where a lot of governments, including the US, learned that their stockpiles were inadequate to deal with the demand, and a concern that there may be vulnerabilities in certain sectors. Again, the question is, what do they do with those conclusions? How do they incentivize domestic production, if that's what they want to do, in a way that doesn't affect their trading partners or break trading rules? But I think we need to be realistic here that there's going to be changes and adjustments made to supply chains. This pandemic has been a wake-up call for existing supply chains. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy, and for your comments. And you're right. I think prioritization is really the key word that I get from your final comment, and particularly those areas like food. It's so vital to the supply of the world that we need to really work together on that. And you mentioned that we have actually covered many points on this 2 hours panel discussion and with our question period as well. And so CCG will also summarize a lot of that, and we report to the relevant organizations. But also we love to also work with our counterpart, I mean, with you and other think tanks to see if there's a common ground that we can seek, and then we can promote this to the WTO to really help on those aspects as well. Now I'd like to have Professor Tu. Your comment, please.
I just want to add a few points on the issue of global supply chains. I agree with Wendy. I think for companies, they really need to rethink, reconsider the balance between efficiency and the resilience of supply chains. It's true, and I think it's just a commercial decision. But if one government wants to build up a kind of complete or self-dependent industrial chains, then it has to take some protectionist measures, which is economically unreasonable, simply because no country can be efficient at all sectors. So maybe for some big economies, they have better conditions for such kind of self-sufficient economic system, like China and the United States. But I think the history of China and the US economic development have shown us that international trade and investment are critical or even indispensable. So I think in the aftermath of the pandemic, there will be a tide of nationalist and protectionist industrialization or industrialization process in some countries and in some industries. But I think people tend to forget bad memories soon. So this kind of concerns, more importantly, economic rationality will prevail again, since international competition for investment and market will always exist. So if you take protectionist measures to build up some industries, then these industries will be less efficient with other compared with other countries. So then probably, as I said, there will be maybe a short time of such kind of reindustrialization or industrialization, but I don't think it will last for a long time. And especially, I think maybe for some industry like medical equipment or medical supplies, the reasonability is stronger than others. But for most industries, it's not rational to so-called to achieve a so-called self-sufficiency. But I think to let it happen sooner, a stronger WTO will help to contain those protectionist measures.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tu, for your comments. Now, because I think we are, also in the last two speakers, I would like to have James, as you are also so experienced, your comment, please.
I thought I would offer just a few concluding words on dispute settlement. First, we are unlikely, in my view, to see any alteration in the policy of the Trump administration on the appellate body crisis or dispute settlement in general, whether the president is reelected or not. As it stands, the dispute settlement process is now de facto exactly as the Trump administration has apparently wanted it all along. If a panel rules against the United States, then the United States can file a notice of appeal into the void because there is no appellate body to hear an appeal. And this prevents the dispute settlement body from adopting the panel report. So in effect, we're back to the days of the GATT when those countries that had the most economic sway were more likely to have their way. As for the interim arrangement that has been developed by the European Union and others, including China, and now embraced, I think, by more than 40 members of the WTO, with others adding to the list as we go, is an effort to make the system work in spite of the intransigence of the United States on the appellate body crisis. In effect, it puts in place through Article 25 arbitration a pool of appeal arbitrators who can serve as a substitute for the appellate body. There are many nuances to this in terms of the efficacy of their decisions and their relationship with existing WTO jurisprudence, but this interim arrangement will have the benefit of preventing, at least in disputes involving those participating countries, a return to the routine blocking of panel reports that we had under the GATT. The downside of this approach, as all participants acknowledge, is that, of course, because the United States is not a party to it, disputes that these countries have with the United States cannot be resolved in this interim way. They must be resolved in the conventional and traditional dispute settlement system, where if some country prevails against the United States will block the ruling. In fact, I believe the United States has already done this in one ruling by a panel earlier this year. Again, I think this is a worthy endeavor that can be of benefit to WTO members in the interim, however long the interim will be. The long-term solution is, of course, to restore the appellate body to its full complement of 7 members and allow it to continue to function as it has for the past 25 years in an independent and impartial way, and upholding WTO obligations in accordance with the customary principles of public international law as required by the settlement understanding. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Barkos, for your comments and on this addressing this the technical appellate body issues. That's really useful. Now I finally have Professor Lee, and so very briefly, we are already run out of time. So
Yeah,
Lee,
I just have two sentences to conclude. Social distancing is going to help to put an end to this COVID-19. But we should do whatever possible to hold back economic distancing. And to respond to this global crisis and possible recession, I think the algebraic responses will not be sufficient. And it will require exponential response, which means that that will involve not just WTO, key national players, and so on. So we need to have, the cooperation across the globe. Thank you.
okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Lee. And now we are coming to the end of this special webinar on the on the WTO and the world and the crisis and how WTO can meet the challenges of the future. We are really very happy that all our panelists has shared great views. We have many consensus, and we have many points that we can keep track. And I think we also provide a very useful public roadmap for future actions for respective countries, and also for the future reform of WTO. And I think those are very, very useful and stimulating, and CCG will do a good summarize of that. And I'm also pleased to report, actually, we had a very good social response, and we had, according to my technical staff, we have several channels. We have 800,000 to 1 million viewers, watched us live tonight. And so once again, we appreciate all your great contributions. And this is really unique. Probably first time in China, we had the 3 largest trading blocs that having this online webinar together, and this proved to be very useful for particularly for us. And so we make a good summarize. So once again, I would like to thank Ambassador Pascal Lamy, former Director General WTO, Ambassador Alan Wolf, current Deputy Director General WTO, Mr. Huo Jianguo, Vice Chair of China Society of WTO, and Ms. Wendy Cutler, former acting U.S. Trade Representative and now Asia Society Policy Institute Vice President, and also Professor James Barkos, and WTO Appellate Body former Chief Judge, and Professor Tu, the Dean of China WTO Research Institute, and Mr. Li, Deputy Chair of the Expert Committee, China Association of International Trade. So on behalf of CCG, we thank our distinguished panelists, the excellent contribution, and we want to thank our viewers in China and throughout the world. Thank you again.